Hello and welcome to our coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm Millicent Walker. First, the headlines. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister urges residents of the eastern regions of Kyiv, Luhansk and Donetsk to evacuate while they have the chance. As fears grow, the Russian forces are gearing up for a large-scale offensive. NATO foreign ministers meet for 2 days of talks on how best to support Ukraine as the war continues. Welcome, everyone. Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister has warned people in large parts of eastern Ukraine to evacuate while it's still possible. In Vereshchuk said that military leaders in the Kharkiv, Donetsk and Luhansk regions were asking local people to try to leave and that they were doing all they could to make this happen in an organized way. If people did not leave, she said, they would soon find themselves under fire and under threat of death. Russia has said it is refocusing its military operations on the Donbass, comprising both the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Kharkiv, Ukraine's second city, is close to the Russian border and has been targeted by Russian forces since the beginning of the war. Meanwhile, residents northwest of Kyiv are picking through the rubble and debris to see what is left of the Ukrainian town of Bucha. This is also as the European Commission proposed sweeping new sanctions against Russia, with the White House going ahead and announcing new blocking sanctions against a number of members of the Russian elite. And that includes Putin's daughters and relatives of Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. We'll bring you more of that report a little later. Meanwhile, Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has asked Irish lawmakers this time on a number of issues, including for European countries to show more leadership when it comes to introducing more sanctions against Russia. In an address to Ireland's Parliament earlier today, Ukraine's president said he could not tolerate any indecisiveness from Western countries on imposing new sanctions. He says we have to put an end to trading with Russia. We have to cut ties of Russian banks to the global system, cut the sources of their income from the oil that they use for their weapons and for the killing. He told a rare joint sitting of both houses of parliament by video link. Speaking via an interpreter, Zelenskyy said Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, including a fuel depot, were hit by Russian missiles overnight and accused Moscow of deliberately provoking a food crisis by using hunger as a weapon. Russia has denied targeting civilians in what it calls its special military operation in Ukraine. Anna Chernikova, VOA's correspondent, joins us now from Kyiv in Ukraine. Hi, Anna. It's good to see you. And it appears you've also moved, from Ivano-Frankivsk, which, we've always been speaking to you from, to Kyiv. Tell us about that journey and what prompted this move.
We've been waiting for the moment to come back, basically, and according to the latest events that happened when the Kyiv region was finally liberated from the Russian forces, the Russian troops, we just took a decision to finally come back, to be closer to, this post-horrific time, to be closer to this area and to stay in the capital. We just moved from the west part back to Kyiv, and obviously the road was much more easier than it was when we were going on the 25th of February from Kyiv to the west part. So situation is definitely changing, and it's changing, inside it's changing positively.
So, Anna, paint us a picture, describe to us the Kyiv where you are now from the Kyiv you left behind to Western Ukraine.
It's completely different towns, completely different cities from what it was on the 23rd of February and what we have now. So the city is very empty, the city is silent. There are a lot of checkpoints around. There are a lot of different security constructions around. Military also coming back and forward, checking, controlling the situation. But town is, coming back to life, and you can feel that, it's very empty and silent, but at the same time, people start coming back to their daily activities. Businesses started to work again, some, coffee places and so on and so forth. So there is a completely different city, but the city, is struggling to live again.
And also speak to us, because we remember the mayor of Kyiv saying that, people shouldn't return yet, wait for a couple more days because there could be munitions that, were still live, and landmines as well. I mean, there are those risks still, aren't there?
Of course, there is not. I don't want you to think that it's completely. It's completely now. It's completely safe now here. Yeah, sorry. So of course there are risks. Of course, everyone understands that. Hostilities could still happen, and we have air raid sirens during the day, a couple of times during the day, and a couple of times during the night. But the city of Kyiv itself, especially those areas that were not affected by hostilities, they seem quite, safe. Of course, areas around that suffered the horrific events, the cities of Bucha, Irpin, Hostomel, Borodanka. Of course, there is still quite dangerous, but still people are coming back at least to see how their houses and how their homes are doing. Of course, they're not come back yet, but still, people start to bring humanitarian aid and so on and so forth, just checking out how people are doing there and so on. A lot of people are coming back. This is true. But of course, everyone are quite, waiting until there is really a good time. So people from the Kyiv region that suffer the most, they still cannot come back.
I know, and like they say, there really is no place like home, so we can understand people wanting to get back to their homes. And give us a sense of what's happening in eastern Ukraine. We understand Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister is urging residents of the eastern regions to evacuate.
Yeah, this is the east part. It's basically the main the area with the main actions going on right now. Russian troops are concentrating there, and in 3-4 days we're expecting a huge attack from Russian troops to the east, on the east parts. So the government is trying to evacuate as much people as possible, and government is asking people to evacuate themselves with their private transport, because they could get into a situation that was in the Kyiv region, when at one point people just were not able to get out at all. So we are expecting very, very huge battles in the coming couple of days.
Also, some of the events we've seen today is the U.S. imposing sanctions on Putin's adult daughters. We've seen targets Russian banks as well. The U.K. imposed sanctions on Russia's largest bank. Have there been any reactions to this and perhaps previous sanctions by the West?
The Ukrainian government were telling their partners, their European partners and US partners, to go on and impose another package of sanctions. Especially these negotiations began after the whole world saw the horrifying images from Irpin and Bucha in the Kyiv region. So the reaction is, well, it was expected that sanctions would come. Of course, Ukraine expects more sanctions and expects more serious sanctions, and and at the same time, in parallel, expect military support. So it's definitely positive reaction, but again, we're in Ukraine. There are hopes for oil embargo at one point.
And finally, Anna, this also follows the outpouring of reactions from the international community on what happened in Bucha. And, you know, there was that meeting with the United Nations Security Council as well. And we've, of course, seen the Ukraine president appealing to, I think he was his latest, to Irish Parliament. And this is to, you know, impose a lot more, show more leadership. But in the overall, with regards to this war, the concentration in the east and the other parts, for Ukrainians fleeing, would you say that it is safe for them to sort of come back? And this is to areas that perhaps appear safe now, since Russia says it's moving that fight to the east.
When you have a wide-scale war, of course, it's not completely safe anywhere. So. And everyone understands that, people understand that. But I should say that, you know, there are more than 40 days now of this terrible war, and people just, you know, have a little bit different perception. So there are risks, but when these risks are minimum, people, you know, take the decisions to come back home or to move closer to their hometowns. And I think this is quite normal, taking into consideration that, well, you cannot find an absolutely 100% safe place. Of course, we all understand that east part of Ukraine are not safe at all. But if we talk about west part and Kyiv at this point of time, well, I can say it's quite safe. But of course, you should understand that the war is going on, and you can feel it and you can smell it in the air.
We appreciate your time. Anna Chenikova joining us from Kyiv in Ukraine. Thank you, and do stay safe.
Thank you.
The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Australian Foreign Minister Marise Payne in Brussels as most of the world's wealthy democratic powers prepare to roll out a new round of sanctions against Russia in response to horrifying images of executed Ukrainians in the city of Bucha. Well, the meeting comes just 2 days after Austrian Finance Minister Magnus Brunner voiced opposition to sanctions on Russian oil and gas, telling reporters in Luxembourg that these would hurt Austria more than Russia. U.S. Secretary of State is expected to press the case for more actions in Brussels this week at NATO and G7 meetings of foreign ministers. U.S. Deputy Treasury Secretary held similar meetings last week in London, Brussels, Paris, and Berlin. The U.S. group of 7 allies are preparing the new sanctions, and we heard earlier what the U.S. has done, and that is more Russian government officials, their family members, imposing more sanctions on them. Well, what we know now is that the U.S. have done such imposed such sanctions, and the UK has also imposed sanctions on Russia's largest bank.
So coming here.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'll just say very quickly what a pleasure it is to see my friend and colleague Marise Payne. We've spent a fair bit of time together in various parts of the world, but it's very good to see you here in Brussels. We're excited at the prospect of bringing some of our partners from the Asia-Pacific together with NATO. That's certainly part of what we're doing here together, but also a lot of work that we're following up on that we've been doing together in the region through AUKUS and many other initiatives that we're engaged in, and of course the situation resulting from Russia's aggression in Ukraine. So lots to catch up on. Great to see you.
Indeed, great to be here Tony, with our team who've just arrived, as you noted, but importantly at this critical time. The critical time for partners like Australia and the United States to be closely joined in response to the actions of authoritarian states that are untenable unacceptable, complete illegal violations, wholesale violations of international law and of the UN Charter. So coming here this week is extremely important for Australia to join with the United States and our partners in that response to make sure that we are working in as coordinated and comprehensive a way as possible. So I'm looking forward to those discussions and also to reinforcing the importance that no matter where in the world they behave like this, authoritarian states cannot be allowed to trample on the rights of democratic countries and of the people who have chosen to live and work in those democracies. So it is a very important engagement.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Mariupol is the Aleppo of Europe and the Guernica of Ukraine. EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell said this at the European Parliament in Strasbourg. The top EU diplomat went on to describe the besieged port city in Ukraine as a martyred city that was destroyed in crimes against the civilian population, war crimes, adding that the EU will take care of that. Mariupol has been under bombardment throughout most of the Russian invasion that began February 24, trapping tens of thousands of residents without food, water or power. And for the first time ever, the clear majority from the Finnish population is supporting the NATO membership. Finnish Foreign Minister Pekka Haavisto told reporters as he arrived at NATO headquarters. The Finnish parliament is expected to debate on the matter in the coming weeks as the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues. And NATO Secretary General invited Haavisto and his Swedish counterpart, Ann Linde, for a trilateral meeting, after which they will join a roundtable meeting with all NATO members. Stoltenberg stressed that a clear majority of NATO allies would welcome Finland and Sweden into the alliance if they decided to join, but any such move is up to the two nations.
Well, our process is quite rapid. First of all, we can say that common opinion has changed very rapidly since the Russian attack against Ukraine. In 3-4 weeks, the clear majority, first time ever from the Finnish population, is supporting for the NATO membership, and the government will give this white paper on security to the parliament on the Easter week, and then of course we leave the debate time for the parliament. Well, when we are analyzing the changes in the European security situation, we can clearly see that many things has changed. One, of course, is that Russia is ready to take bigger risks, as we can see in Ukraine, bigger risk also for its own security. We can also see that Russia is capable of gathering more than 100,000 men against just one country, even without touching its reserves. And also we can see that the discussion on possible use of tactical nuclear weapons or chemical weapons, the threshold has been lowering, at least in the debate. And of course, we have to be also from the Finnish side ready for different kinds of security scenarios.
Still to come on the program is more about that meeting with NATO foreign ministers as they meet for 2 days of talks on how best to support Ukraine as the war continues. Please stay with us. Welcome back. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has warned the conflict in Ukraine can last for a long time and called for the military alliance to increase its deterrence capacity. He told reporters ahead of the NATO foreign ministers meeting in Brussels, calling for the perpetrators of a series of killings in Bucha and other Ukrainian towns to be punished. Earlier on today, some 20 Ukrainians laid outside the European Council to pay tribute to the Bucha victims and to call for an EU response. Since Russian troops withdrew from towns and villages around the Ukrainian capital, Ukrainian troops have been showing journalists corpses of what they say are civilians killed by Russian forces, destroyed houses and burnt out cars.
And also to rewrite the international order. So we We have seen no indication that President Putin has changed his ambition to control the whole of Ukraine and also to rewrite the international order. So we need to be prepared for a long haul. We need to support Ukraine, sustain our sanctions, and strengthen our defenses and our deterrence. Because this can last for a long time, and we need to be prepared for that. We have all seen the atrocities that have been committed in Bucha and other places in Ukraine. This reveals the true nature of President Putin's war. Any targeting and killing of civilians is a war crime, and therefore NATO allies are supporting the international efforts to establish all the facts, to investigate and to make sure that perpetrators are punished. Thank you.
Meanwhile, China is urging the United States to stop its unilateral sanctions on Russia over the more than 1-month-old Russia-Ukraine conflict, which can only further damage the global economy that has already been suffering. This is according to the Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian. He said this today. The Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies of Renmin University of China recently published a report elaborating on the U.S. sanctions against Russia and their adverse impact on the world. Now, the report says the escalating sanctions against Russia cannot help solve any problem, but on the contrary, they will exacerbate global inflation, disrupt supply chains, and hamper economic recovery. He said since the conflict between Russia and Ukraine broke out, the U.S. has been increasing unilateral sanctions on Russia and coercing other countries to take sides. This report he mentioned points out that in the past 8 years, from 2014 till now, a group PF countries led by the United States, a group of countries led by the United States imposed over 8,000 sanctions on Russia, which overtakes Iran as the most sanctioned country in the world. Mr. Li Jiang said when he was asked to comment on the press conference, he said that the U.S. has been reaping profits from the war and sanctions, and that history and reality have made it clear these sanctions cannot guarantee peace and security, but will only lead to a lose-lose situation, further impacting the already languishing world economy, the existing global economic system. He says if the U.S. is serious about easing the situation in Ukraine, then it should stop adding fuel to fire, stop imposing sanctions, stop coercive words and deeds, and truly commit to promoting peace talks. And as Russia's invasion of Ukraine territories continues, world leaders have been rallying to suspend Russia from its seat on the UN's top human rights body. This comes in light of the Bucha killings. According to Ukraine's Prosecutor General, the bodies of 410 civilians have been removed from Kyiv area towns that were recently retaken from Russian forces. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev says the country feels no impact from the expulsion of its diplomats by various European countries and indicates Russia will respond in kind. But at the UN Security Council, Russian representative Nabenza Vasily rejected accusations of war crimes by Russian troops in Bucha, arguing that they are flagrant inconsistencies in events shown by Ukrainian and the Western media. The Russian representative to the UN Security Council repeated the baseless Russian allegation that Ukraine's government, led by Zelenskyy, who is Jewish, are Nazis. He claims the corpses found by reporters in the city were not there right after the withdrawal of the Russian forces. Let's now take a look at the UN Security Council's meeting on the situation in Ukraine. And joining us right now is Professor Abayomi Akinye, a lecturer, diplomatic history in the Department of History and Strategic Studies at the University of Lagos. He joins us now virtually. Thank you for joining us on the program.
It's my pleasure joining you.
All right, Professor, you might want to, thank you very much. You might want to turn down the volume of your television set, yes, so that you can hear hear my question. I want to begin by what the UN Secretary General said. We must silence the guns. He called for an end to the war in Ukraine. Is it one call too many? Is the United Nations able to do anything as Ukraine cities continue to be bombarded?
Well, it's not a meeting too much. When you have an emergency like this, in most cases you have people, you have UN sitting in permanent session. So it's not a case of a meeting too much, it's an emergency. So the length of time spent is worth it because of the potentiality of the crisis to escalate to the discomfort of not only the two parties concerned, but humanity in general. The sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, even though it's intended for Russia alone, is having worldwide impact. So any attempt to solve this problem as soon as possible is well in order.
President Zelenskyy said that the UN Charter is being violated, and he asked a question. He said, so what is the point of the other charters and, you know, the representation of the US? Interestingly, the UN Secretary General Assembly has called for the entire withdrawal of Russian forces, and this is for the second time. They talked about the seizing of all military operations, but then it has also rejected accusations by Russian troops in Bucha. However, as much as the UN is calling for that, Russia, with the situation in Bucha, is rejecting it, saying that, you know, they didn't cause this. What do you think will happen in the coming days? And this is especially as there appears to be that call by other parts of the world for the UN to take a decision. And this is with perhaps removing Russia from the Council, from the Assembly.
Well, it is often said that the first casualty in wars is truth, because each of the contesting party would like to present reality from their own perspective. What has been shown is from Western media, and Russia has also gone out to say what you have is fake and that it does not reflect reality. What should be done is to have an independent inquiry to look to ascertain the veracity of the images that have been shown. As for the call of the removal of Russia, this is not, this will be one-sided. It will not be fair at this point in time to go all out and excite Russia. This will signal the collapse and disintegration of the UN system in itself. We should not take a decision in the heat of disagreement, in the heat of passion and emotion, as is happening at now. An investigation should be conducted to ascertain the authenticity of the images that have been shown. It's only after that that a more rational and sober decision can be taken. As it is now, I will advise that the UN continues the way it is continuing, come up with investigation, independent investigation, comprising of both Russian and non-Russian parties, and then it's after that that a true decision can be taken.
I want to stay on what President Zelenskyy said. He also talked about wars in other countries like Syria and Afghanistan, and you know, was a little disappointed with, you know, the reaction of the United Nations with the situation in his country, Ukraine. But when we look at the role of the UN, even in those other wars, you know, can we call this perhaps precedence, and which also sort of exacerbated Russia's invasion of Ukraine, making it inevitable?
I don't think so. It's true that in the past, the United Nations has come under severe stress and strain, but then it only calls to relevance the need for a review of the United Nations system itself. But this cannot be done at the heat of a crisis and passion, as is the situation at the moment.
Let's come back to what you said about independent investigation. And the question is, who would lead that? Which country do you think? Is it Turkey? Is it even China? China, we've heard from the spokesman who said that the U.S. is fighting a lose-lose situation, that it should stop all of the sanctions, which would, on Russia, which inadvertently would affect the rest of the world. Which country do you think should lead, spearhead this independent investigation? And that will be seen as credible.
It will be a mutually agreed committee of nations. I'm not a lawyer, but lawyers have a maxim of natural justice, which is nemo judes in causa sua. Don't be a judge in your own matter. By imposing this litany of sanctions and this, the U.S. and the Western parties have shown that they are parties to this crisis. And so they will not be the ones to instigate an investigation into the alleged Russian excesses. It has to be an independent jury that will ascertain and authenticate the allegations that have been made. It's only after that. And the United Nations can come up with members of countries that are not directly connected with this dispute. Maybe members from the previous non-aligned group who will look into the matter and then make a pronouncement. But as it is, you can't be a judge in your own matter. The U.S. and the Western nations have led the world in imposing sanctions on Russia. And so whatever investigation is led by them will have a shortcoming of being conducted by interested parties.
The UN, in its observation of the meetings that both parties have had, said that both sides require good faith, and they talked about earnest efforts. Is this something you've noticed in the negotiations and the meetings that the foreign ministers have had? And this is on both sides, Russia and Ukraine.
Both of them, from my observation, have not been negotiating in good faith. While they are talking, on the other hand, they are intensifying the crisis. They are doing other things that will make it difficult, if not impossible, to reach an agreement. I think there should be a more neutral way of conducting this negotiation. If we go on at this rate, it's not likely that any agreement will be reached. The UN should, first of all, put in place a ceasefire. And then after that, both parties can come together. And maybe they use good offices of a neutral party to negotiate. But the way they are going, agreements are not likely to be reached.
We always appreciate your time on the program, Professor Yomi Abayomi Akinye, lecturer, diplomatic history, Department of History and Strategic Studies, University of Lagos. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you. It's my pleasure being with you.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has imperiled global food security, creating suffering within Ukraine and displacing millions while disrupting agricultural production and trade from one of the world's major exporting regions. The U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, says they are seeing price increases, but looking at supply stocks, particularly for staples. This and more from the discuss of the consequences of the war in Ukraine on food security, organized by the U.S. Department of State's Africa Regional Media Hub.
Africa Regional Media Hub.
It's a digital press briefing on the impact of the ongoing Russian aggression in Ukraine, its impact on food security in Africa and around the world, organized by the Africa Regional Media Hub. Featured speakers are Ambassador Cindy McCain, the permanent representative of the U.S. mission to the UN agencies in Rome, and Dr. Jim Banhart, assistant to the administrator and the U.S. Agency for International Development's USAID's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, and other journalists. According to the United Nations, 40% of wheat and corn exports from Ukraine go to the Middle East and Africa. Ukraine itself was a major source of wheat for the World Food Programme, with the WFP feeding 138 million people in more than 80 countries, including Ethiopia, South Sudan and Nigeria. The Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that as many as 13 million more people worldwide will be pushed into food insecurity as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ambassador Cindy McCain, the permanent representative to the U.S. mission to the United Nations agencies in Rome, says the Russian invasion of Ukraine has brought food security in the global spotlight, skyrocketing food and fertilizer prices and critical grain shortages in some of the poorest countries.
As long as Russia continues this brutal campaign, innocent people are going to pay the price. I was recently in Kenya and Madagascar and saw firsthand some extremely vulnerable communities that will suffer even more because of Putin's war. As Assistant Administrator Jim Barnett will tell you, the United States is very focused on mitigating the effects of this conflict and other shocks to the food system. As a government, we've invested heavily in resilience building programs and committed to providing more than $11 billion over the next 5 years to address food security and nutrition needs worldwide. But Russia alone can stop this global catastrophe we're facing and also being felt on the African continent and beyond.
For the assistant to the administrator and the Bureau of Resilience and Food Security, before Russia invaded Ukraine, the food security context was already concerning due to the lasting COVID-19 impact, ongoing humanitarian emergencies, and high global food prices, among others.
And from the last global food crisis in 2007 and 2008, we saw the destabilizing effect this can have on international order. During that time, food riots occurred in at least 14 African countries. And even with the release of grain reserves or the cessation of hostilities, the impacts will persist. There will be irreversible effects on food production as farmers lack the resources and inputs to plant their spring and summer crops. But there's much that we can do. Following the food price spikes in 2008, President Obama launched the U.S. government's Feed the Future initiative, and it brought American ingenuity to bear to invest long-term in sustainable food systems. And Feed the Future and its partners are working to strengthen resilience, food systems, agriculture investments, and improve nutrition, which are foundational to our long-term goal of improving household well-being.
While addressing specifically a question on Nigeria and how the U.S. is going to help those countries that already were experiencing some issues with food insecurity, Dr. Banhart had this to say.
The idea of promoting local investments in agriculture products, I think is a good one, and I think we can have debates about the policy measures that are the best way to do that. Nigeria has chosen to do what's called a import substitution model, where they ban imports and products to promote that. We can discuss that. I think the bottom line is that if the Nigeria smallholder farmer is able to improve their quality of life, then that would be something we'd want to talk further about. But it's an interesting idea.
The meeting ended with hopes that there can be strengthening of policies that support open trade and robust food systems for the continent and the rest of the world. Millicent Walker, Channels Television News. Still ahead, we bring you more excerpts of Ukraine's president's address to Irish lawmakers today, where he said that Russia is provoking a food crisis. We also have a guest joining us on food insecurity. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Ukraine President, in his address to Irish lawmakers today, he said Russia is provoking a food crisis. He said it would have international ramifications because there will be a shortage of food and the prices will go up. President Zelenskyy spoke by video to a joint session of Ireland's two houses of parliament, the latest in a string of international addresses he has used to rally support for his country, Ukraine.
Viewed by Russia as a target, and this is, dear people of Ireland, this night our territory was again hit by Russian missiles. It was done cunningly and it hit civilian infrastructure. The new fuel storage depot was hit, and this is viewed by Russia as a target, and this is their attribute. They're destroying things that are sustaining livelihoods.
Let's talk some more about food security in Africa. Joining us is African farmer Mogaji. He is the founder, Agric Business NG. Thank you for joining us at this time.
Thank you for having me.
Let's get your take, your assessment of Russia's invasion in Ukraine and on food security in Africa. What are some of those food types you think are likely to be affected by this? And do you see things worse as being predicted by a lot of, international partners?
Well, yes, excuse me. Yes, one of the main foods of staples that we've not been talking about is oil. Ukraine produces over 50% of global sunflower consumption. And when the sunflower oil is not available, it will put pressure on other oils, vegetable oils. So other oils will go very expensive very soon, especially end of this month. Yes, we've spoken about wheat, but we've not focused on maize. Ukraine produces 10% of global exports and production of corn, and corn affects all livestock generally, from cattle, poultry, pigs, dairy. Everything is dependent on corn. So as other countries will not be exporting corn for fear factor, basically, our livestock across Africa will be heavily challenged. Yes, we talk about wheat as wheat for flour. We don't talk about wheat bran, which is the back of the wheat, which is also used in livestock feed. So basically, we would have those really being affected. And almost all our multinationals that are involved in the FMCG value chain, all of them will be affected.
In terms of what you've listed, Nigeria appears to pride itself with some of the initiatives it's made in fertilizer, and this is also perhaps since 2016. This is also something we understand likely to be affected as a result of the invasion. Tell us if indeed we've cushioned that impact of the war on fertilizer, and perhaps what these other things you've mentioned, sunflower and maize and wheat, and how it can impact, really affect Nigeria now as a country.
Well, we would give something to this administration. I think in 2016, the president went to sign an agreement with some fertilizer companies in Morocco, which was very proactive. Now we will not be dependent on Russia, like U.S. has to pay dearly for their heavy reliance on fertilizer. And well, the Dangote that just came up is also supposed to cushion that effect. But I don't actually think that we may have that effect being cushioned. Because don't forget, apart from OCP, which have plants in Nigeria, Dangote, to the best of my knowledge, also want to sell locally, but all of them are still business people. So you will find people from neighboring African countries come to Nigeria, buy these fertilizers, and take to other West African regions. So the people in Nigeria may actually be paying higher, which will eventually mean that we will not have access to the fertilizers. And I can tell you that is what is likely to play out because we currently can block rice from coming in. So how do we block fertilizer, which is about the same? So, but we won't be in a bad situation when we consider that we still have those bilateral agreements and those companies that have set up and the Dangote plant that just sprang up.
Would you say that Africa has been able to diversify its agricultural imports following looming threats, I mean, climate change and then water scarcity? And on the other hand, can Africa be self-sufficient in food production?
Well, Africa ideally should be self-sufficient, but Africa is not as a whole. We're not self-sufficient. We heavily depend on foreign imports across board. Wheat in, I think about 20% of wheat in Russia comes to Africa. You know, Africa is heavily dependent on wheat in Russia and Ukraine. And these are things we can produce ourselves. Even we may not have the comparative advantage, but we still can, you know, produce what we need. Africa is not looking inward, and it's something more than 2 decades. We need to look inwards now. In fact, we need to bail Europe out now. Europe may have the money, they may have the infrastructure, we have the lands, we have the people, and climate is still better here than there because most of the lands in Europe and in US is overcultivated. So Africa is at the best time for Africa. We are well positioned, but we're not taking advantage of the things we can. Africa, it's a mindset thing, basically. It's not the resources that we have or we don't have. It's a mindset. It's a leadership thing. We don't believe in ourselves. But guess what? The foreigners believe in us and they are taking advantage, trying to do some barter here and there. But we need to believe in ourselves. And I've always said this, we need to have square pegs in square holes. Until we pay attention to agriculture across Africa, like the Europeans and Americans pay attention to that, we won't be able to take advantage of it. United States is heavily, when you say United States is united, it's agriculture that unites all those states together. And so we also need to come up with that, maybe United Africa, that is an agriculture value chain or ecosystem that binds us together. And especially when we look at it from regional, like West Africa, North Africa, you know, but we need Africa to feed the world now.
Indeed. And perhaps on a final note, what are some of those policies that you expect from governments, Nigerian government, governments across Africa, and also how indeed you think security partners can also help?
Yeah. So,
To be having...
Can you hear me?
Yes, please, we can. Go right ahead.
Okay. So our youth policy in agriculture needs to be revamped. We focus too much on the Ministry of Agriculture as against the Ministry of Youth and Development. We need to find a way. Government across boards, 2 decades now, we've been trying to develop the sector, and it's always the same story. Funding not getting to the rural farmers in the capacity in which it needs to get there. So we need to revamp things. We need to bring a lot of media into the agri space. Without the media, we can't move forward. And beyond that, markets. Markets is very crucial. And our mechanization policy needs to be top-notch now. At best, left to me as a player across West Africa, we need to play low on just giving seed fertilizer chemicals and focus heavily on small-scale mechanization. We need more mechanization across Africa. are not trying to adopt and adapt Europe and US equipment, it doesn't work for us. Europeans and Americans are running away from their type of agriculture, and we are trying to embrace it. We need small scale. We need India's type of agriculture, India's types of equipment. Those are what we need here. And the countries, the African countries that are really doing well are embracing the China, Malaysia, and India model of small and medium scale mechanization. Mechanization should be top-notch on any of the African governments' initiatives now for us to be food sufficient and for us to be able to take care of Europe right now. Because we need the Russia-Ukraine war, Africa needs to take care of Europe.
We do appreciate your time. Thank you for also joining us such short notice. African farmer, Mogaji, founder, business, Agric Business NG. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's take you through some of the key events of today. Day 42, just in case you were wondering, it's still heavy fighting and Russian airstrikes which continue in Mariupol. This is coming from the British military intelligence. They're saying the humanitarian situation in the city is worsening. Most of the 160,000 remaining residents have no light or communication, medicine, heat or water. According to Russian Defense Ministry, it says its forces will liberate Mariupol from Ukrainian nationalists. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden has approved $100 million transfer of Javelin armor-piercing missiles to Ukraine. That's according to an administration official. Ukraine's human rights ombudswoman has said between 150 and 300 bodies may be in a mass grave by a church in Bucha, where Ukraine accuses Russian troops of killing civilians. Russia called the allegations regarding Bucha a monstrous forgery aimed at denigrating the Russian army. Meanwhile, 600,000 have been evacuated to Russia. Russia's UN ambassador said they've been evacuated to Russia during the conflict, denying Kyiv's claim of mass deportation. We're not talking about any kind of coercion or abduction, but rather the voluntary decision, he says, by these people. That's coming from Russia's UN ambassador, Vasily Nebenzia. And that's been a one-hour coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine at this time. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Walker. Stay safe.